Welcome to episode 13, the externality nobody counted. You know, if you close your eyes right now and just picture a forest fire, I guarantee a very specific, dramatic image just popped into your head.
Oh, yeah, it's always that same footage you see on every evening news broadcast.
Exactly. A massive wall of flame, right? A crown fire roaring through the canopy, entire mature trees just, vaporizing into a giant plume of smoke. I mean, it feels like absolute total destruction.
It does, and we watch that footage and naturally assume the forest is simply gone. Like, the intuitive leap is that all the carbon stored in those trees has just been instantly relocated to the atmosphere.
Which makes perfect sense visually, but when you actually look at the empirical measurements, the data from the people who walk into the ashes afterward to weigh what is physically left, that mental image completely shatters.
It really does. It is, it's the definition of a structural blind spot. Though before we get into those measurements, we really need to be incredibly precise about what we are and are not saying in this deep dive.
Right, yeah. Let's establish those ground rules immediately because this is an important coda to our series. Over our previous 12 explorations, we arrived at a very specific verdict regarding forest carbon, and I want to be clear that verdict stands.
Completely.
We concluded that restoration thinning, mechanically clearing out smaller trees and brush, is not a near-term carbon strategy. It costs carbon up front, and it cannot currently be financed through carbon markets. None of what we discussed today overturns those findings.
Right. Every single clause of that previous verdict survives intact.
Yeah.
The mission today is not to walk back the math on carbon. The mission is to open a question we haven't asked yet in this entire series, which is whether carbon was actually the smaller of the two ledgers all along.
Okay, let's unpack this. To answer that question, we are leaning heavily on a research annex and dossier compiled by Nick McKenzie. And his background is fascinating because it's not what you'd expect for a forestry analysis.
Not at all.
He's a physician. Specifically, he trained in anesthesia and then spent decades in clinical practice in Monterey County and the Salinas Valley. Today, he builds software for the forestry and carbon offset world.
And his trajectory is really crucial for you to understand because his standing here is strictly clinical, not silvicultural.
Right.
Like, he has never worked on the Colville National Forest in Northeast Washington. He has never worked in British Columbia. He offers absolutely no field observations from the backcountry.
He was entirely on the other end of the problem.
Exactly. He spent a career at the receiving end of exposure, treating the cardiorespiratory admissions in the hospital when the outside air goes bad. So he views the forest through his own profession's vocabulary, which is exactly why he noticed the column that is just entirely missing from the standard forestry ledger.
So to figure out if we've been looking at the wrong ledger, we have to rethink what we see when we look at that wall of flame. We think we know what a high-severity fire does, but when researchers actually measure a burned landscape, what is physically happening to the trees?
Well, they don't burn up, at least not the way the evening news footage implies.
Okay.
The empirical data shows that only about 22 to 23% of a stand's pre-fire above-ground carbon actually combusts, even in a high-severity fire.
Wait, I need to stop you there. Only 22%. That means nearly 80% of the carbon is still sitting right there in the forest after the fire goes out.
It is. I mean, the fire is incredibly efficient at consuming what we call fine fuels. So the litter, the leaves, and the duff, which is that spongy, decaying layer of organic matter on the forest floor.
Right.
But the trees themselves. In 2007, John Campbell and his colleagues published a plot-based accounting of the Biscuit Fire in Oregon, and they meticulously measured the large conifer bole. The bole is the trunk, the overwhelming majority of a mature tree's mass.
And what did they find?
The measured bole combustion factor was exactly 0.00.
Zero. The fire didn't consume the trunks at all.
Not at all. The trees just die standing. We call them snags. And, the public conversation obsesses over the smoke plume and completely ignores the snags. But the snags represent the vastly larger number.
But they don't stay standing forever, right?
No. This carbon leaves the forest slowly over the following 3 to 5 decades as those dead trees eventually rot, fall over, and decay.
So it's like the immediate fire is just the appetizer,
Yeah.
and the slow decay is the actual main course.
This is a very good way to conceptualize it. Across a whole mixed severity fire perimeter, this committed flux, the delayed carbon release from decay, is 1.4 times larger than the immediate combustion pulse.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and a 2012 study by Barden Guymeyer and colleagues modeled the entire western United States, and they put the regional ratio at 2.6, 2 to 1.
Okay.
Dead pools to atmosphere.
Okay, if you're listening to this and trying to calculate the climate impact in your head right now, we need to pause and be scrupulously careful with our units. The entire episode turns on this math. When we talk about carbon in these trees, we're not talking about carbon dioxide.
Right. Failing to make that distinction is probably the most common mistake in forest carbon arguments. Carbon and carbon dioxide differ by a factor of 3.667.
3.667.
Yes, you have to multiply the mass of carbon by 3.667 to get the mass of carbon dioxide. Conflating the two understates the climate impact nearly fourfold.
And here's where we also need to introduce a massive caveat about this delayed decay. It's like looking at the gross deductions on your paycheck without counting the tax refund you get later in the year.
The paycheck analogy is the perfect way to look at it. The per-acre carbon figures we are discussing are gross figures, not net.
Right.
This is the regrowth condition, and we really must state it out loud every time we talk about these committed emissions. A burned stand that regenerates repays most of that carbon debt through regrowth.
Because as the dead snag decays over decades and releases carbon, the new saplings growing around its base are pulling carbon back out of the air to build their own trunks.
Exactly. The gross emission from decay only becomes a permanent atmospheric addition where the stand fails to come back. What we call vegetation-type conversion, like a forest turning permanently into a shrubland. But if the trees grow back, the debt is largely repaid.
Which brings us to the central mystery of this deep dive. If the carbon impact of a fire is mostly delayed over decades, and most of it gets repaid by regrowth anyway, what is the immediate, permanent consequence of that massive smoke plume? And this is where Nick McKenzie's clinical background suddenly makes everything click into place.
Right, because if you want to understand the true cost of a fire, you have to look at public health. Wildfire smoke contains particulate matter, specifically PM2.5.
The really small stuff.
Yes, particles so small they bypass your body's natural defenses, reach deep into the lung tissue, and cross directly into the bloodstream. And to turn that cardiorespiratory endpoint into a dollar figure, you have to use a regulatory tool called the value of a statistical life, or VSL.
I have to admit, VSL sounds incredibly cold. Like an actuary is just slapping a barcode on a human being and calling it a day.
I know. But Nick McKenzie is very exact and a little unsparing about what this metric is and what it is not. VSL is not a price on a person.
Right.
No doctor is standing in an emergency room looking at a patient and assigning a dollar value to their survival. VSL is a willingness to pay aggregation.
How does that actually work in practice? How do you aggregate that?
You observe what a large population will collectively pay for tiny reductions in their own everyday mortality risk. For example, researchers look at wage premiums, how much extra a company has to pay workers to take on slightly more hazardous jobs.
Oh, I see.
Or they look at how much everyday people spend on safety equipment to reduce their risk of an accident by a fraction of a percent. You take those small amounts of money and sum them across a massive population until those tiny fractions of risk reduction add up to one expected death avoided.
It is a very dry statistical instrument, but it is the official published instrument used across the government.
It is.
So when you look at the current federal tables, what is the actual dollar amount for a VSL?
Well, the Environmental Protection Agency uses $11.3 million for a 2025 analysis year. And the Department of Health and Human Services uses $14.1 million for 2026.
So we take that value of a statistical life and we apply it to the actual tonnage of smoke drifting into a city.
Right, through what the EPA calls the benefit per ton table. The EPA's values for directly emitted PM2.5 range from $99,000 to $479,000 per short ton.
Wait, let's emphasize that unit for anyone taking notes. That is per short ton, not per ton.
Yes, that is vital. A short ton is 2,000 pounds. But here is the structural blind spot. The EPA's official table covers 21 different industrial sectors, from power plants to agriculture.
But not forests.
Exactly. It does not have a sector for wildland fire. The forest is completely missing. So researchers had to derive the wildfire-specific number. Using 2017 data from Luke Denon and colleagues, the derived cost for western wildfire smoke is roughly $59,000 per short ton.
$59,000 per short ton of smoke.
And 98% of that monetized total, 98% is premature mortality.
This is where we have to combine the two ledgers, right? The gross carbon and the smoke. If we look at a single acre of burning forest, what is the actual total uncosted damage?
Well, if we use the EPA's 2023 shadow price for carbon, which is a theoretical estimate of unpriced climate damages set at $190 per ton of carbon dioxide. A landscape average fire causes roughly $11,400 in gross carbon damage per acre.
Okay, 11,400. And when you add the health impacts from the smoke.
The smoke damage is roughly $9,600.
Wow.
Combine them, and you are looking at around $21,000 of uncosted damage for a single average burned acre.
But fires aren't average everywhere. What happens in a high-severity patch where the fire is just raging through a dense, dry stand?
The numbers escalate dramatically. In a high-severity patch, the gross carbon damage leaps to between $31,600 and $37,800 per acre.
And the smoke?
The smoke damage is estimated between $18,300 and $36,600.
Let me just digest that for a second. In the worst patches, you are staring at a combined total of $50,000 to $74,000 in invisible damage for a single acre of land.
Yes, but we must throw a flag on the play here. We have to restate the regrowth condition for those massive carbon numbers.
The paycheck analogy again.
Yes, every time we mention those committed emissions, we have to remember those committed carbon numbers in the high-severity patches, which drive a huge portion of that $74,000 figure, are gross figures, not net.
Right.
A burned stand that repays most of that debt through regrowth. The emission is a permanent atmospheric addition, only where the stand fails to come back.
We also need to clearly flag the high-severity smoke figure itself because we promised to test this thesis rigorously. The estimate of 0.31 to 0.62 short tons of PM2.5 per acre is extrapolated rather than published.
Exactly. It is derived from plausible fuel consumption models, not from a published physically measured figure. Until a published fuel consumption model is run specifically for high-severity dry conifer, that high-severity smoke estimate is the weakest number in the chain of logic. We really cannot treat it as established fact.
Still, even if we just look at the landscape average wildfire doing $21,000 of damage per acre, mostly in public health and delayed gross carbon, a listener might assume the obvious answer. Just prescribe more fire.
Right.
Burn the underbrush deliberately, under controlled conditions on a cool day, to avoid the catastrophic high-severity burns later. But when you dig into the science, prescribed fire is deeply contested.
This raises an important question, because it completely cuts against our intuition. We have to look at the dissenting evidence, and we must give it real weight and equal airtime.
Okay, let's hear it.
In 2025, Luke Denon and his colleagues calculated the national fire smoke damages for the year 2017. Wildfire caused $99.4 billion in damage. Prescribed burns caused $101 billion in damage.
Hold on. Prescribed burns caused more national damage than wildfires. How is that mathematically possible when a prescribed burn emits so much less smoke per acre?
It comes down to geography. The entire range of health damage isn't just about the chemistry of the smoke. It's about where the ton of particulate matter lands.
Okay.
In the United States, prescribed burning is heavily concentrated in the heavily populated Southeast. Wildfires predominantly burn in the sparsely populated West. A ton of smoke dropped on a dense population center does exponentially more economic and health damage than a ton of smoke lofted over a remote mountain range in Idaho.
Which means mortality isn't strictly tied to the raw amount of smoke. There's a massive variable we're missing, and it's the wind. There's a 2024 study by Laura Keeley and colleagues that modeled a landscape in California, and it proves exactly this point.
Their finding is absolutely critical to understanding dose response. They found that cutting prescribed fire emissions by 48% relative to a wildfire only bought a 2.5% mortality reduction, dropping expected deaths from 40 down to 39.
Cutting emissions in half only saved one expected life.
Because the wind, on the day of the prescribed burn, carried the remaining smoke directly toward populated areas. But when they ran the model differently, optimizing the burn timing purely for wind dispersion, intentionally sending the smoke away from populations, while keeping the emissions' identical mortality drop from 40 expected deaths down to 15.
Which way the wind blows is worth more than having the smoke.
Exactly. Anyone quoting a sheer emissions reduction percentage as a guaranteed health benefit is making a fundamental error. It's entirely about population exposure. And that brings us to a modeling study by Anna Rosenberg and colleagues, also from 2024.
What did they look at?
They modeled a proposed 500,000-acre California prescribed fire program. And they found it would actually increase cardiorespiratory emergency department visits simply because of the frequent, repeated, low-level smoke exposure to nearby communities.
Wow. And for total transparency, we have to mention the paper that we couldn't even read. There is a paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences whose title directly contradicts the optimistic consensus on prescribed burns. The research confirmed this paper exists, but could not read it because it was paywalled. We will not characterize an argument nobody has read.
No, we won't. But even with that robust dissent, there is compelling evidence on the other side of the ledger regarding catastrophe prevention. A 2026 paper in Science by Yvonne Higuera-Mendieta and Marshall Burke found that low-severity fire cuts the probability of subsequent very high-severity wildfire by 92.4% in the treated footprint.
And those protective benefits last a long time, right?
Yes, well over a decade.
So if prescribed fire, while obviously controversial and complex, can significantly reduce the risk of a $74,000 an acre high-severity catastrophe, why isn't anyone paying for this? Like, why can't we credit avoided smoke to fund forest treatments?
Because of a stunning, verified negative finding in Nick McKenzie's dossier. There is no market mechanism anywhere in the United States that monetizes avoided smoke. Not in the carbon registries, not under the Clean Air Act, not in any state program.
What about the EPA's exceptional events rule? Doesn't that deal with wildfire smoke?
It does, but it is a barrier removal tool, not a crediting mechanism. The exceptional events rule allows the state to essentially exclude smoke-affected air quality days from their official regulatory records so they aren't penalized for a natural disaster.
Oh, I see.
It assigns the smoke no value whatsoever, whether avoided or incurred. It just erases the data from the ledger.
Okay, but we have the EPA's benefit per ton math. They already use it for 21 industrial sectors. Why can't a carbon registry or a health agency just apply that math to forests to fund preventative thinning or smart prescribed burns?
It's the exact same problem that killed the carbon credits in our previous deep dives. The counterfactual problem.
Right. It's like trying to get an insurance payout for a car crash you avoided by driving safely today. The insurance company's going to say, prove you were definitely going to crash and prove exactly how much the hospital bill would have been. You just can't do it.
That is exactly the structural hurdle. To sell a credit for avoided smoke, you have to prove, with a measurable, additional, verifiable baseline, the absolute probability of a wildfire that didn't happen.
Which is impossible.
You have to prove it would have burned, at what exact severity, when it would have happened, which way the wind would have been blowing, and exactly how much smoke it would have made. No registry or market is willing to underwrite the probability of a complex weather and combustion event that didn't occur.
Zooming out, this brings us back to Nick McKenzie's clinical observations. He spent a career in the Salinas Valley watching the real people who are forced to breathe this unpriced externality.
I want to land his formulation at the close here, using his exact words. Reflecting on this missing ledger, he notes, as in so many other domains, public health is the ultimate uncosted externality.
And as you think about that, realize this isn't just a forestry quirk. It's a pattern we see well beyond fire. We saw it historically with leaded fuel. We see it with deciding where to build coal plants or with occupational dust exposure. If a harm lands diffusely on strangers downwind and the resulting illness shows up years later under some other medical billing code, society just leaves it off the ledger.
We are left with a grand asymmetry. We have a public health externality smoke that causes roughly $100 billion a year in damage across the country. And there is absolutely no market instrument attached to it.
None at all.
Sitting right beside a much smaller externality carbon that has an entire global market infrastructure, registries, protocols, and verification bodies built around it. We built a global market for the small number, and we structurally ignored the large one.
It really leaves you with something to chew on long after this deep dive is over. What other massive, invisible public health costs are hiding in plain sight in our society simply because the harm lands diffusely on strangers downwind and the source is considered natural? Like and subscribe, it really helps the channel reach others.